Hey, family. Welcome to Mr. Gray Family, where every story begins with us. Janet sat alone in a cramped storage closet with one of her heels dangling from her hand, while muffled jazz drifted through the walls outside. A few feet away, people laughed loudly enough for her to recognize Alexander's voice among them. That hurt more than anything. Not the tightness in her chest, not the embarrassment burning across her face, not even the sting in her eyes she kept blinking away before tears could fall. It was the fact that her husband sounded perfectly comfortable out there, while she sat hidden between stacks of folding chairs and unopened boxes of Christmas decorations like something that needed to stay out of sight. For a second, Janet honestly thought she might have misunderstood him earlier. Maybe he really did need a moment. Maybe there was some emergency with his boss. Maybe she was overthinking everything. But the longer she sat there alone, listening to glasses clink and people socialize without her, the harder it became to lie to herself. Alexander had left her there on purpose. Her fingers tightened around the silver heel in her lap. The back of her foot was red from where the strap had rubbed against her skin all evening, but she barely noticed anymore. Her mind was too busy replaying the moment near the ballroom entrance. Stay here. I need to sort something out. At the time, his voice sounded nervous. Now it sounded ashamed. Janet swallowed hard and looked down at the polished floor beneath her feet. She had spent nearly 2 hours getting ready for this party, carefully curling her hair, reapplying lipstick twice, standing in front of the mirror, hoping tonight would feel different from all the other work events where Alexander acted like introducing her was some complicated task. Outside, another burst of laughter echoed through the hallway. Her stomach twisted. She sat alone beside stacks of folding chairs while her husband laughed with executives outside like she didn't exist. Janet pressed her lips together and stared toward the door. For the first time all night, she seriously considered leaving without saying a word. Welcome to Mr. Gray Family, a storytelling universe built for people who crave meaning, emotion, and unforgettable narratives. Here, every story begins with a spark and ends with a feeling you'll carry long after the video ends. Love, betrayal, family, secrets, lessons, it's all here, wrapped in immersive narration that makes you forget everything else. If you're searching for stories that pull your heart, challenge your mind, and keep you coming back, subscribe now. Your story begins the moment you choose to stay. The music outside suddenly lowered. Not completely, just enough for Janet to notice the shift. The laughter in the ballroom faded into scattered murmurs, followed by the sound of chairs moving across the floor. Even from inside the storage closet, she could feel the energy changing. Somebody important had arrived. Janet slowly slipped her heel back onto her foot and stood carefully. Her knees felt weak from sitting too long, though she knew that wasn't the real reason her body felt shaky. Curiosity pulled her toward the door before pride could stop her. She cracked it open slightly. Through the narrow opening, she could see the edge of the ballroom. Employees who had spent the entire evening talking over one another were suddenly standing straighter, adjusting jackets, smoothing dresses, checking their posture. A few people even stepped aside toward the walls. That was when applause started near the entrance, soft at first, polite, but growing louder by the second. Janet frowned and opened the door a little wider. A tall man in a dark tailored coat walked into the ballroom with the calm confidence of someone fully aware that every eye in the room belonged to him. His silver-streaked hair was combed neatly back, and the smile on his face looked effortless, practiced without feeling fake. Desmond King. Even Janet recognized him immediately. Alexander had talked about him for weeks. The Billionaire CEO who had recently taken over the company. The man everybody wanted 5 minutes with tonight. Employees surrounded the entrance almost instantly, eager handshakes and nervous smiles spreading across the room as Desmond greeted people one by one. Janet stayed half hidden behind the storage door, watching quietly. She had no reason to step out there, not after the humiliation she already felt, but something made her keep looking. Desmond moved slowly through the crowd, speaking to people briefly, while executives practically leaned forward, waiting for his attention. Near the ballroom bar, Janet spotted Alexander laughing too hard at something one of his co-workers said. Her chest tightened again. He still hadn't looked for her. Not once. Janet exhaled softly and started pulling the door closed again, but Desmond suddenly stopped walking. His eyes lifted above the crowd, straight toward her. Janet froze. For one strange second, the noise around the ballroom seemed distant, Desmond stared directly at the partially open storage door. Directly at her. Janet's fingers tightened around the edge of the storage door. No, there was no way he was looking at her. She glanced behind herself instinctively, almost expecting another person to be standing there. But the narrow hallway behind her was empty. When she looked back again, Desmond King was already moving through the crowd, toward her. Conversations around the ballroom began fading one after another as people noticed the direction he was heading. A woman near the champagne table stopped mid-sentence. Two men standing beside the stage turned completely around. Even the band seemed uncertain, their music lowering awkwardly. Janet's heartbeat slammed against her ribs. What was happening? Across the room, Alexander finally noticed. At first, confusion crossed his face. Then came panic. Real panic. Janet watched her husband straighten immediately and step away from his coworkers, his eyes darting quickly between her and Desmond like he was trying to stop something before it happened. But it was already too late. Desmond reached the center of the ballroom floor and smiled warmly the moment their eyes met again. "Janet," he said clearly. The entire room went still. "There you are." A shocked silence swept across the ballroom. Janet felt her breath catch completely. How did he know her name? Behind Desmond, Alexander looked like the color had drained straight from his body. The same husband who hid her moments earlier now looked terrified, as the billionaire smiled at his wife, like she was the most important person in the room. And Janet still had no idea why. Imagine being so ashamed of your wife that you leave her hidden in a storage closet during the biggest company party of your career, only for the most powerful man in the room to walk in and search for her by name. Janet thought being abandoned in that hallway was already humiliating enough. She thought the night couldn't possibly get worse. She had no idea that within the next few minutes, her husband's entire world was about to shift right in front of everyone he worked with. And honestly, it raises a real question. Have you ever loved somebody who made you feel invisible the moment other people were watching? Because that kind of pain stays with people. So before we go deeper into this emotional story, comment below and tell me honestly, what would you have done if you were in Janet's position? And if you enjoy powerful stories about love, mistakes, relationships, and second chances, make sure you like this video and subscribe to Mr. Gray Family because it truly helps this channel grow and reach more people who love meaningful storytelling. Now, let's rewind a few hours earlier, back before the music, before the humiliation, before Billionaire CEO Desmond King walked into that ballroom looking for Janet Green. Rochester looked frozen solid outside the townhouse windows. Snow covered the sidewalks in uneven layers, and the evening sky had already turned dark even though it was barely past 4:30. Wind pushed against the glass hard enough to make a faint whistling sound through the corners of the living room window. Inside, warmth settled softly through the house. Christmas lights still hung along the mantel from the holidays, casting small golden reflections across the walls, while Janet stood in front of the bedroom mirror adjusting the neckline of her dark green dress for the third time in 10 minutes. She stepped back again, looked carefully, then leaned forward once more. Maybe the earrings were too much. Maybe the lipstick was too dark. Maybe she should have worn her hair up instead. Janet sighed quietly and lowered her hands to the edge of the dresser. She hated feeling nervous around her own husband, but tonight mattered. Not because of the party itself, not because Alexander's company executives would be there, not even because the billionaire CEO was rumored to attend. What mattered was the small hope sitting inside her chest, that maybe tonight Alexander would finally look proud to have her beside him in public, not careful, not cautious, proud. From the other room came the low sound of Alexander's voice during a work call, calm, professional, controlled. Janet picked up her perfume bottle and sprayed lightly near her neck before glancing toward the hallway. She could hear him laughing softly now, a different laugh than the one he used at home. At work, Alexander always sounded lighter, sharper, like a man completely certain of himself. She walked carefully toward the bedroom door and peeked into his office. Alexander sat behind his desk, wearing a white dress shirt with one sleeve still unbuttoned. His laptop screen reflected against his glasses while numbers and charts filled the monitor behind him. Papers covered half the desk. "Yeah, absolutely," he said into his headset. "Tomorrow morning works. I'll clean up the presentation tonight." Janet smiled faintly. Even after 3 years of marriage, she still admired how driven he was. Alexander finally glanced up, and noticed her standing there. His eyes moved over her dress quickly before returning to the laptop screen. "You almost ready?" he asked distractedly. Janet folded her arms lightly. "That's all I get." He muted the microphone. "What?" "That look." She smiled teasingly. "I spent an hour getting ready, and all I get is, you almost ready." Alexander gave a tired chuckle. "You look nice, Janet." Nice. The word landed heavier than it should have. Still, she forced a smile. "Just nice?" He leaned back in his chair. "You know what I mean." "No," she said playfully. "I actually don't." For a moment, Alexander studied her properly, and there it was, that hesitation again. Small, quick, but always there before work events. "You look beautiful," he said finally, though the words came out quieter than she expected. Janet nodded slowly, accepting it, but something still felt missing. Alexander unmuted his call again, almost immediately. The moment disappeared. Janet stood there another second before turning back toward the bedroom. As she reached for her clutch purse, she caught her own reflection again. Beautiful. Why did it always sound difficult for him to say around other people? That question had followed her through almost every company dinner, networking event, and office gathering since they got married. At home, Alexander was affectionate, funny, gentle, but around certain crowds, especially wealthy corporate circles, something about him changed. His shoulders stiffened. His smiles looked rehearsed. Even the way he introduced her sometimes carried uncertainty she tried not to notice. Tonight, she promised herself not to let those thoughts ruin the evening. She grabbed her heels and sat carefully on the edge of the bed while fastening the straps. From the office, Alexander ended the call with a professional goodbye before finally stepping out. He adjusted his cufflinks while walking toward the mirror beside her. "You nervous?" Janet asked softly. "A little. That makes two of us." Alexander gave a small smile while fixing his tie. "You'll be fine." Janet looked up at him carefully. "You say that like I'm the one you're worried about." That made him pause, only briefly, but she noticed. Alexander reached for his coat hanging nearby. "It's just an important night." "For your job?" "For everything." Janet stood slowly. The room suddenly felt quieter than before. She walked closer and straightened the front of his tie gently with both hands. "Hey," she said softly, "we're supposed to be a team tonight, remember?" Alexander looked down at her. For 1 second, guilt flashed across his face so quickly she almost missed it. Then he leaned forward and kissed her forehead lightly. "This is my night," he said in a calm voice. "Let me handle things." Cold air rushed around them the moment Alexander opened the front door. Janet pulled her coat tighter across her chest as they stepped outside into the Rochester evening. Snow crunched beneath their shoes, while wind swept loose flakes across the sidewalks and parked cars lining the street. Alexander hurried ahead slightly, pressing the unlock button on his SUV. The headlights flashed. Janet climbed into the passenger seat carefully, smoothing her dress beneath her legs before shutting the door against the freezing air outside. The heater hummed softly as Alexander started the engine. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Streetlights reflected across the windshield, while the wipers pushed away thin layers of snow. Downtown Rochester glowed faintly ahead in the distance, its buildings shining against the dark winter sky. Janet rested her purse in her lap and glanced sideways at Alexander. He looked tense already. One hand tapped lightly against the steering wheel while the other adjusted the heat settings even though the car was warm enough. "You okay?" she asked gently. "Yeah, you don't sound okay." Alexander exhaled through his nose. "Just thinking about tonight." Janet smiled faintly. "You've hosted presentations for rooms full of investors before. That's different." "How?" "At least presentations have structure." She laughed softly. "So your coworkers scare you more than investors?" That pulled a quick smile from him. Something like that. The tension inside the car eased slightly after that. Outside, snow drifted steadily across the roads, while small restaurants and coffee shops passed beside them, glowing with warm light. Janet watched bundled pedestrians crossing intersections with scarves wrapped tightly around their faces. Rochester always looked quieter during winter, almost thoughtful. Janet turned toward Alexander again. "You know, we haven't gone out together in a while. We went out last month. That was grocery shopping." Alexander chuckled under his breath. "Fair point." "I'm serious," Janet said. "Tonight could actually be fun if you let yourself relax." I am relaxed. She raised an eyebrow immediately. Alexander noticed and gave in with a small laugh. Okay, maybe not completely. Janet shifted slightly in her seat so she could face him more comfortably. Then let me help. With what? With whatever has you acting like you're heading into battle. Alexander shook his head lightly. You always make things sound dramatic. That's because you always act like everything has to be perfect. The words hung there a second longer than Janet intended. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, not angry, just uncomfortable. She noticed immediately and softened her tone. I didn't mean that in a bad way. I know. Another silence settled between them, not hostile, just heavy. Janet stared out the window briefly before speaking again. You know what would help tonight? What? A dance. Alexander looked at her like she'd suggested something impossible. A dance? Yes. One dance. She smiled. Maybe two, if you behave yourself. He groaned quietly. Janet. What? Married couples dance at parties. Not these kinds of parties. She laughed softly. What kind are these exactly? Corporate parties. And corporate people don't dance? They mostly stand around pretending to enjoy conversations about quarterly earnings. Janet covered a laugh with her hand. That sounds miserable. It usually is. Then, maybe they need me there. Alexander finally smiled properly for the first time that evening. There she is, Janet teased. I was wondering where my husband went. His smile faded again quicker than she expected. Not completely, but enough for Janet to notice. She looked at him carefully. Alexander, are you embarrassed to bring me tonight? His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. No. The answer came too fast. Janet lowered her eyes briefly. You hesitated earlier when you saw me dressed up. I was distracted. You always say that. Alexander stayed quiet. Traffic slowed ahead near an intersection downtown. Red brake lights stretched across the snowy street, while soft jazz played quietly through the speakers. Janet suddenly felt foolish for asking. Still, she couldn't stop herself. Sometimes, she said carefully, I feel like you become a different person around people from work. Alexander kept his eyes forward. What does that mean? It means... Janet paused, searching for the right words. At home, you make me feel loved. But at these events, it's almost like you don't know what to do with me. He swallowed hard enough for her to notice. That's not true, isn't it? Another silence, longer this time. The heater continued humming softly between them, while snow tapped lightly against the windshield. Janet looked down at her hands. Would you stay with someone who made you feel invisible? The thought hurt more because she didn't fully know the answer herself. Alexander finally cleared his throat. I just want tonight to go smoothly. It can. You don't understand how these people are sometimes. Janet looked over slowly. What people? He immediately regretted the wording. You know what I mean. No, she said quietly. I don't think I do. Alexander rubbed one hand across his mouth before pulling into the curved entrance leading toward Midtown Event Center. Golden lights wrapped around the building columns outside, while luxury cars lined the front entrance beneath falling snow. Employees in formal coats disappeared through the large glass doors, laughing loudly together. Alexander parked the SUV and stared ahead for one brief second before turning off the engine. We're here, he said quietly. The warmth inside Midtown Event Center hit them almost instantly. After the freezing Rochester air outside, the ballroom felt bright, polished, and alive. Golden lights reflected off tall glass walls, while soft jazz drifted across the room from a live band near the stage. Conversations blended together beneath the sound of clinking glasses and distant laughter. Janet paused just inside the entrance. The place looked expensive in a way that made her suddenly aware of every detail about herself. Women in sleek designer dresses stood beside men wearing tailored suits and polished watches that probably cost more than her monthly rent before she married Alexander. Servers moved carefully through the crowd, carrying silver trays filled with champagne. Even the air smelled expensive. Alexander, meanwhile, changed the second they walked in. His shoulders straightened. His smile sharpened. His voice carried more confidence. Alexander! A man called from across the room. Alexander immediately lifted a hand. Hey, good to see you. Before Janet could even fully remove her coat, two more people approached him at once. Handshakes, quick laughs, work talk, deadlines, numbers. Predictions for next quarter. Janet stood quietly beside him at first, waiting naturally for the introductions that usually came with being someone's wife, but they didn't. Alexander stayed locked into conversation while Janet remained half a step behind him, holding her coat awkwardly over one arm. A woman passing by offered Janet a polite smile before turning her full attention toward Alexander instead. "You did great on that merger presentation," she told him. "Thanks," Alexander answered easily. Janet glanced toward him. Nothing. No introduction. No acknowledgement. Not even a small touch on her arm. She looked away quickly before disappointment could fully settle on her face. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe he simply forgot. Still, the feeling from the car returned quietly to her chest. Invisible. A server passed nearby, and Janet reached for a glass of sparkling water, mostly to give herself something to hold. Alexander was laughing now, relaxed, comfortable. It amazed her sometimes how different he became around coworkers. At home, Alexander often liked silence. He preferred quiet evenings, documentaries, takeout dinners on the couch. Here, he moved through conversations like he belonged in them naturally, like this version of him had been waiting underneath the surface the whole time. Janet tried joining the discussion once. "So, how long have you all worked together?" she asked gently. One of the men answered politely enough, but his attention drifted back toward Alexander before she even finished nodding. The conversation continued without her again. Janet lowered her eyes toward her glass. Alexander finally glanced at her briefly. "You okay?" "Yeah," she answered softly, but she wasn't. They moved farther into the ballroom together, though together barely felt accurate anymore. Every few feet, another person stopped Alexander to greet him. Each time, Janet expected him to pull her closer and proudly say her name. Instead, he kept drifting forward while she followed slightly behind, not abandoned, not officially, just excluded enough to feel it. Near the center of the ballroom stood a massive Christmas display covered in silver ornaments and white lights stretching almost to the ceiling. Couples gathered nearby, taking photos while executives clustered around the open bar, laughing loudly. Janet noticed several women glance toward her curiously before looking away. One quick smile, then dismissal. She suddenly became painfully aware that she was one of the only black women in the room. Alexander noticed it too. She could tell by the way his posture stiffened anytime attention shifted toward them together. That hurt more than she expected. Not because strangers noticed, because he noticed and cared. "Alexander," Janet said quietly as they paused near a long dessert table. Can we maybe stay together a little?" His eyes moved quickly around the ballroom before landing back on her. "I just need to say hello to a few more people." "You've been saying hello since we walked in." "I know." "Then, introduce me." The words came out softer than she intended. Alexander rubbed the back of his neck quickly. "Janet." Before he could continue, another voice interrupted nearby. "Alexander Bliss?" A group of executives approached immediately, drawing his full attention again. Janet watched his entire expression shift. Professional, focused, alert. One of the men shook Alexander's hand firmly while speaking about investors arriving later in the evening. Janet stood there quietly beside them for nearly 30 seconds, before realizing nobody had acknowledged her existence. At all. Not one person. Her face burned. Alexander finally leaned closer toward her, while the executives continued talking among themselves. "Stay here," he whispered quickly. Janet frowned. "What?" "I need to sort something out." "What does that mean?" But Alexander was already stepping away. Fast. Too fast. He disappeared into the crowd, almost immediately, without turning back once. Janet stood frozen beside the dessert table, holding her untouched drink, while conversations continued around her like nothing had happened. For several long seconds, she genuinely thought he would come back. He didn't, and slowly, painfully, Janet realized her husband had just left her standing alone in the middle of the party. Janet stayed exactly where Alexander left her. At first, she told herself not to overreact. Maybe he really did need a quick conversation with the executives. Maybe he planned to come back in a minute. Maybe she was letting old insecurities get into her head again. So she waited. The cold glass in her hand slowly warmed against her palm, while people moved around her in clusters of conversation and laughter. Nobody stopped long enough to notice how uncomfortable she looked standing alone beside the dessert table. A server passed carrying tiny chocolate pastries arranged perfectly across silver trays. Another walked by balancing champagne glasses. Still no Alexander. Janet glanced toward the crowd again, trying to spot him between shoulders and dark suits. She finally caught sight of him near the ballroom bar, speaking with 3 executives. He looked completely absorbed in the conversation. One of the men laughed loudly at something Alexander said, and Alexander laughed too, relaxed, comfortable, like he hadn't just left his wife standing by herself in a room full of strangers. A painful knot formed quietly in Janet's chest. She looked away before he could accidentally catch her staring. 2 women around her age stepped beside the dessert table moments later. One wore a white fur shawl wrapped carefully around her shoulders, while the other adjusted a diamond bracelet near her wrist. Janet offered a polite smile. "Those look good," she said lightly, nodding toward the pastries. The women smiled back politely enough, but only briefly. "You should try the champagne tower," one of them replied distractedly, before leaning closer toward the other woman again. Their conversation continued immediately, without Janet included in it. Janet lowered her eyes toward her drink. Again, another small reminder. She didn't belong here. A few seconds later, one of the women glanced back toward Janet, curiously. "Are you with someone from the company?" she asked. Janet forced another smile onto her face. "Yes. My husband works here." "Oh," the woman nodded slowly. "Which one is he?" Janet turned slightly toward the ballroom crowd and pointed carefully. "Alexander Bliss." Both women followed her gesture. Recognition crossed their faces immediately. "Oh," the second woman said softly this time. The energy changed. Not badly, but noticeably. Janet knew that look. The quick surprise, the polite correction afterward, the realization that Alexander Bliss's wife was black. One woman recovered faster than the other. "Well, you look beautiful tonight." "Thank you," Janet answered warmly, but the compliment felt rushed, careful, like something said out of obligation. Within seconds, the women excused themselves politely and disappeared back into the crowd. Janet stood there, alone again. This time, the silence around her felt louder. She suddenly became aware of little things she hadn't noticed earlier. How many people glanced at her before quickly looking away. How nobody approached her naturally, unless forced by proximity. How Alexander still hadn't returned. A man passing by nearly bumped into her shoulder before muttering a distracted apology and continuing forward without even slowing down. Janet stepped farther away from the center of the ballroom, pretending to admire the Christmas decorations near one of the side walls. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment now. Not dramatic embarrassment, not loud humiliation, the quieter kind. The kind that slowly settles into your stomach while you pretend everything feels normal. Across the room, Alexander finally looked in her direction. Relief flickered through her instantly, but instead of walking over, he only gave her a quick nod before turning back toward the executives beside him. That hurt more than if he ignored her completely, because now she knew he remembered she was there. He just wasn't coming back yet. Janet swallowed hard and adjusted the strap of her heel slightly. Pain shot through the back of her foot immediately. She winced. The shoes had already started rubbing against her skin during the drive over, but standing still so long had made it worse. She shifted her weight carefully, trying not to limp. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared enough to notice. A soft laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Not because anything was funny, because the entire situation suddenly felt ridiculous. She spent hours getting ready tonight. Hours. Choosing a dress, curling her hair, trying to look perfect beside a man who now acted like standing next to her publicly required emotional preparation. Janet blinked quickly and looked toward the ceiling for a second. Do not cry here. Not here. Not in front of these people. She grabbed another napkin from the dessert table, mostly to keep her hands busy. That was when the thought finally settled clearly into place for the first time all evening. He hid me, not physically, not aggressively, but carefully enough that nobody important would have to ask questions. The realization drained something inside her. Janet slowly slipped one heel off beneath her dress and pressed her aching foot lightly against the floor. Relief spread upward instantly. She closed her eyes for one brief second. When she opened them again, she noticed a narrow hallway near the ballroom kitchen entrance. Quiet, empty, hidden from the crowd. Without looking back toward Alexander again, Janet picked up her heel, straightened her dress carefully, and walked silently toward the hallway alone. A few seconds later, she disappeared behind the small storage room door. The storage room smelled faintly like cardboard, cleaning supplies, and artificial pine decorations packed away after the holidays. Janet closed the door carefully behind her and leaned against it for a moment without moving. The muffled jazz outside sounded distant now, softer, like it belonged to another world completely. She finally let out the breath she'd been holding since Alexander walked away from her near the dessert table. Then she looked around slowly. Stacks of folded chairs lined one wall beside plastic storage bins labeled with black marker. Extra tablecloths sat piled on metal shelves beside unopened boxes of wine glasses, still wrapped in paper. Not exactly where she imagined spending the evening. Janet walked toward the chairs and sat carefully, placing one heel beside her foot while rubbing the sore skin near her ankle. The relief barely registered emotionally. Her mind was too full. For several seconds, she simply stared ahead quietly while the sounds of the ballroom continued beyond the walls. Laughter, music, glasses touching. Alexander was still out there somewhere, enjoying the night, while she sat hidden in a supply room trying not to cry. Janet shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered to herself. "Don't do this." But the thoughts kept coming anyway. Every awkward company dinner, every moment Alexander hesitated before introducing her, every forced smile whenever coworkers asked surprised questions after meeting her for the first time. She remembered one networking event nearly a year earlier when Alexander introduced her so quickly to a group of investors that nobody even caught her name. The entire conversation moved around her afterward, like she wasn't standing there. At the time, she convinced herself she imagined the discomfort. Tonight made that lie harder to believe. Janet rubbed both hands slowly over her face. Maybe Alexander didn't realize what he was doing. Maybe his fear of judgment had become so normal to him that he couldn't even see it anymore. But Janet saw it. She felt it every time his body stiffened around certain crowds. Every time his confidence disappeared, when attention shifted toward them as a couple, her chest ached thinking about it. Because despite everything happening tonight, she loved him. That was the painful part. Alexander was not cruel at home. He remembered how she took her coffee. He rubbed her feet after long workdays. He kissed her forehead absent-mindedly while cooking breakfast on Sundays. Those things were real, which made this confusion harder to process. How could someone love you deeply in private, but still fear standing fully beside you in public? Janet lowered her eyes toward the floor. Maybe the problem wasn't him. Maybe she simply didn't fit into his world the way she wanted to believe she did. The thought sat heavily inside her stomach. Outside the room, applause suddenly erupted somewhere inside the ballroom. Janet looked up immediately. The music faded lower afterward, replaced by the sound of dozens of voices blending together at once. Something had changed outside. She could feel it even through the walls. Janet stayed still, listening carefully now. A few quick footsteps passed the hallway outside the storage room. Someone laughed loudly. Another voice spoke excitedly about the CEO. Janet frowned slightly. Desmond King. Alexander mentioned earlier there was a chance the billionaire owner might attend tonight, though apparently he rarely stayed long at company events. More applause followed. Stronger this time. Janet sat quietly for another moment before shaking her head lightly at herself. None of that mattered. She should probably leave. Honestly, she didn't even know if she wanted to go back into the ballroom at all tonight. The idea of returning out there alone again made embarrassment crawl back into her chest immediately. Her phone rested inside her clutch beside her. For one dangerous second, she considered ordering a rideshare home without even telling Alexander. Let him explain that later. But she already knew she wouldn't do it, because no matter how hurt she felt, Janet still wanted him to come looking for her. That realization frustrated her more than anything else. Outside, the crowd noise shifted again. More movement, more excitement. Janet slowly stood from the chair and slipped her heel back onto her foot carefully, wincing slightly as the strap pressed against irritated skin again. Then, she heard a woman's voice outside the hallway say quietly, "He's here." Immediately after that, came another wave of applause from the ballroom, louder than before. Janet stared toward the storage room door. Her pulse quickened slightly despite herself. Somebody important had just entered the party. Janet stood motionless for another few seconds after the applause faded. Her fingers tightened slightly around the heel strap at her ankle, while voices echoed through the hallway outside the storage room. He actually came. I heard he almost canceled. That's him near the entrance. Janet swallowed slowly. Curiosity pushed against the embarrassment still sitting heavily inside her chest. Carefully, she stepped toward the door and opened it just enough to look outside. The hallway remained mostly empty now. Nearly everybody had gathered deeper inside the ballroom. Janet hesitated. Part of her wanted to stay hidden until the night ended. Another part refused to spend the rest of the evening sitting beside folding chairs while Alexander pretended everything was normal. She straightened her posture slightly and stepped into the hallway. The jazz band had lowered their music considerably by the time Janet reached the ballroom entrance again. Conversations blended into one excited current of voices all aimed toward the front doors, and standing near the center of that attention was Desmond King. Even from a distance, his presence carried weight naturally, not loud, not performative. People simply reacted when he entered a room. He wore a dark charcoal suit tailored perfectly against his broad frame, with silver streaks cutting cleanly through his neatly combed hair. A few executives surrounded him already, eager smiles stretching across their faces while they shook his hand one after another. Desmond handled the attention calmly, comfortably, like a man long accustomed to powerful rooms. Janet stayed near the side entrance, careful not to draw attention toward herself. She only meant to glance briefly before slipping away again, but something caught her attention immediately. Alexander. He stood closer to Desmond, now among the executives near the ballroom center. Janet noticed the nervous energy in his posture instantly. His smile looked tighter than before, too careful, too alert. One executive leaned close to Desmond, saying something Janet couldn't hear over the crowd noise. Desmond nodded politely before scanning the room while another person greeted him. Janet looked away quickly. This had nothing to do with her. She should leave Alexander to his important work conversations and... Desmond's eyes stopped, directly on her. Janet froze. For one confusing second, she genuinely thought he must be looking at somebody else standing nearby. She glanced behind herself instinctively. Nobody. When she turned back again, Desmond was still staring toward her through the crowd. Not vaguely, not casually, directly. Janet's pulse stumbled hard inside her chest. What was happening? Around Desmond, conversations continued, but Janet noticed his attention no longer seemed focused on anyone speaking to him. His expression shifted slightly, recognition settling across his face slowly, almost warmly. Then he smiled, not polite corporate smiling, real recognition. Janet took half a step backward automatically. Across the ballroom, Alexander followed Desmond's line of sight. The second he realized where Desmond was looking, the color in his face changed immediately. Panic, pure panic. Janet had never seen that expression on him before. Alexander straightened instantly and moved away from the executives beside him, like he suddenly needed to intercept something before it happened. But Desmond had already started walking. The crowd parted naturally around him as he crossed the ballroom floor with calm confidence. Every step toward Janet made the room quieter. People noticed. A woman near the champagne tower lowered her glass slowly. Two employees standing beside the stage turned completely around to watch. Even the jazz musicians seemed distracted. Janet's throat tightened. Why was he coming toward her? Her mind raced desperately through possibilities. Had they met before? Maybe through Alexander? Maybe at another company event years ago? But nothing made sense. Desmond stopped only a few feet away from her. Up close, he looked even more commanding than he had from across the room. Tall, composed, gray eyes sharp behind thin gold-framed glasses. But his expression remained unexpectedly kind, warm, even. "Janet," he said smoothly. The sound of her name coming from his mouth made her stomach drop. "There you are." Silence swept across the nearby crowd. Janet could physically feel people staring now. She blinked once, completely stunned. "I'm sorry." Desmond's smile widened slightly. "I've been looking for you." Behind him, Alexander finally reached the edge of the growing crowd surrounding them. Janet turned toward her husband instinctively. His face had gone pale, not angry, not confused, afraid. And somehow that frightened Janet, more than Desmond knowing her name. "Desmond." Alexander started quickly, though his voice sounded strained now. Desmond glanced back politely. "Alexander, good to see you." Then his attention returned immediately to Janet again, as if she mattered more in this moment, as if the entire ballroom had faded into the background. Janet's heartbeat pounded painfully now beneath the growing silence around them, because she still had absolutely no idea why one of the most powerful men in the room was smiling at her like they shared a secret nobody else understood, and Desmond King was still walking closer. Janet stared at Desmond for several long seconds without speaking. Everything around her suddenly felt distant again. The music, the conversations, even the people standing nearby, watching them. None of it made sense. Desmond, however, looked completely comfortable standing in front of her, as though this reunion was the most natural thing in the world. "I'm sorry," Janet said carefully, still trying to process what was happening. "Have we met before?" A soft smile crossed Desmond's face. "We have." Behind him, Alexander stayed unusually quiet. Janet noticed him immediately. His shoulders looked stiff now, and the confident energy he carried earlier around his co-workers had disappeared completely. He stood slightly behind Desmond, watching the interaction carefully, like he was trying to predict where the conversation might go next. Desmond turned back toward Janet fully. "You probably don't remember me right away," he said. "It was a few years ago." Janet frowned slightly. Desmond continued gently. "Community health clinic on the south side. Your husband's company sponsored part of it before the merger happened." The memory didn't arrive instantly, but something about the words pulled faint images forward in Janet's mind. A crowded gymnasium, long folding tables, children running between chairs while volunteers handed out winter supplies. She blinked slowly. "The clinic near Highland Hospital?" she asked. Desmond smiled wider. "That's the one." Janet looked genuinely surprised now. "Oh my God." Alexander shifted uncomfortably nearby. Janet remembered pieces of it now. She had volunteered to help organize decorations and community outreach for the event, because Alexander's company asked employees' families to participate. At the time, Alexander had still been climbing his way upward professionally, and Janet wanted to support him however she could. She remembered arriving early that morning, carrying boxes of printed signs and donated supplies. She remembered helping elderly visitors fill out paperwork because the volunteer desk became overwhelmed. And suddenly, she remembered him, not as Desmond King the billionaire, just a tall man in rolled-up sleeves helping move medical equipment between rooms while speaking kindly to everyone around him. Janet let out a quiet breath. "You were there almost the whole day." Desmond nodded. "Longer than most people expected me to stay." A small laugh escaped Janet before she could stop it. "I remember thinking you looked familiar, but nobody told me who you were until afterward." "That's probably why we had such a normal conversation," Desmond replied warmly. For the first time all night, Janet smiled naturally. A real smile, not forced, not polite. Alexander noticed immediately. His expression tightened slightly. Desmond glanced briefly around the ballroom before returning his attention toward Janet again. "What I remember most isn't the clinic itself," he said. "It's what happened after." Janet tilted her head slightly. "The cleanup," Desmond explained. "Most people left once the cameras and speeches were finished. And now she remembered that too. The gymnasium had looked exhausted afterward. Empty coffee cups everywhere. Half-deflated balloons tied to chairs. Volunteers slowly heading home one by one. Janet had stayed behind, because several older volunteers were struggling to carry boxes back into storage. "You stayed nearly 2 extra hours," Desmond said. "You helped everybody clean without complaining once." Janet laughed softly in disbelief. "That was years ago. Still mattered." His answer came quickly, sincerely, and that sincerity hit harder than Janet expected. Desmond remembered details Alexander himself probably forgot, not because Janet was important socially, not because she was somebody's wife, because he noticed how she treated people. The realization settled quietly between them. Alexander looked down briefly. Janet saw it happen. A flash of regret crossing his face so quickly, most people would have missed it. But she didn't miss it, because for the first time tonight, someone in this room was looking directly at her instead of through her. Desmond folded one hand calmly in front of himself. "Honestly, Janet, I've thought about that clinic several times over the years. There were a lot of important people there that day." His eyes held hers steadily. "But you were one of the few who treated everyone in that building like they mattered equally." Janet felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her throat, not because the compliment was dramatic, because it was genuine. Alexander finally spoke again, though his voice lacked the confidence it carried earlier that evening. "You remembered all that?" he asked quietly. Desmond looked toward him calmly. Some people leave stronger impressions than others. The answer wasn't cruel, but it landed heavily anyway. Alexander fell silent again, and standing there between them, Janet slowly realized something painful. The stranger in front of her had noticed her worth years ago, while her own husband spent tonight trying not to let people notice her at all. The tension around Janet slowly eased for the first time that night. Not completely. She was still standing in the middle of a ballroom full of strangers, while one of the most powerful men in the company spoke to her like an old friend. But something inside her relaxed anyway, because Desmond wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't speaking to her carefully, and he wasn't looking over her shoulder searching for somebody more important to talk to. He was simply present. "You still live on the south side?" Desmond asked. Janet nodded. "Not far from where I grew up, actually." Desmond smiled lightly. "That explains why you knew all the best coffee spots during the clinic." Janet laughed softly. "I can't believe you remember that. You practically gave me a tour list." "That sounds like me." "You mentioned equal grounds first," Desmond said. "Then you argued that people judging Rochester food without trying cluck if you buck should lose speaking privileges." Janet covered her mouth, laughing harder now. "Okay, I definitely said that." Even Alexander looked surprised hearing that version of her. Desmond glanced toward him briefly. "Your wife's very convincing when she talks about food." "She is," Alexander answered quietly. But Janet noticed how different his voice sounded now. Smaller. The balance in the room had shifted, and everybody could feel it. Earlier that evening, Alexander moved through the ballroom like somebody completely in control. Now he mostly stood there watching, while Janet held the attention naturally. And the painful part for him was this: she wasn't trying to. Desmond gestured toward a quieter section near the side of the ballroom, where the music sounded softer. "Mind if we step over there?" Hard to hear with everybody pretending they enjoy jazz this much. Janet smiled immediately. "I knew I wasn't the only one thinking that." They moved together toward a smaller cocktail table near the windows, while Alexander followed a step behind them, almost automatically. Snow drifted softly outside the tall glass walls overlooking downtown Rochester. The city lights reflected faintly against the falling snow, while warmth from the ballroom fogged parts of the windows. Desmond leaned lightly against the table. "So tell me something. Are you still doing design work?" Janet blinked in surprise. "You remember that too? You designed the flyers for the clinic. I thought nobody even looked at those." "I did." That answer landed gently, but firmly. Janet felt herself smiling again before she could stop it. "I still do graphic design," she admitted. "Mostly freelance projects now." "She's extremely talented," Alexander said quickly. Janet turned toward him slightly. It was the first proud thing he'd said about her publicly all evening, but even he seemed to realize how late it came. Desmond nodded thoughtfully. "Doesn't surprise me." Alexander shoved his hands into his pockets quietly. Janet noticed the discomfort in his face growing stronger with every passing minute. Not anger, not resentment, something worse. Recognition. Because Desmond was praising qualities Alexander already knew existed, yet somehow failed to defend in the room tonight. A server approached, offering drinks. Desmond declined politely. Janet asked for water. Alexander took whiskey. That small difference somehow said everything. For a brief moment, none of them spoke. The music shifted into another smooth instrumental piece, while conversations continued around them again. Now that the initial excitement of Desmond's arrival had settled, Janet glanced around carefully. People were still watching occasionally, not openly, but enough to notice. Earlier, those same people barely acknowledged her existence. Now several employees looked toward her curiously, because Desmond King was standing beside her speaking like she mattered. The realization brought mixed emotions: validation, relief, sadness, because it shouldn't have required a billionaire's attention for people to see her value. Desmond seemed to understand that, without her saying it aloud. "You know," he said calmly, "rooms like this can make people forget how to treat each other properly." Alexander lowered his eyes immediately. Janet looked at Desmond carefully. He continued speaking gently. "A lot of people spend too much energy trying to impress whoever holds power nearby. The silence after that sentence felt deliberate, heavy. Alexander shifted uncomfortably beside them, and Janet suddenly realized Desmond wasn't just making conversation anymore. He noticed everything. The distance earlier, the awkwardness, the fact that she'd been standing alone. He knew, if you've ever been in a room where somebody suddenly sees the pain you've been trying to hide all night, then you already understand why Janet could barely speak in that moment. Because being noticed emotionally can feel just as overwhelming as being ignored. Desmond looked back toward Janet. "Honestly," he said, "I'm glad you came tonight." Janet smiled softly. "I almost didn't. That would have been unfortunate." She tilted her head slightly. "Why?" Desmond's expression turned thoughtful, then serious. "Because I've actually been searching for you." Janet stared at Desmond after hearing those words. "I've actually been searching for you." For a second, she honestly thought she misunderstood him. "Searching for me?" she asked carefully. Desmond nodded once. "I wanted to reconnect after the clinic, but I never had the chance. Then recently I came across some of your design work online connected to a community fundraiser." Janet blinked in surprise. "You saw that?" "It was excellent." Alexander stood beside them in complete silence now. Janet could feel the tension coming off him without even looking directly at him. Desmond continued calmly. "I asked around after recognizing your name connected to the event planning materials. Once I realized you were Alexander's wife, I hoped you'd attend tonight." That sentence hit Alexander hard. Janet saw it immediately, because suddenly the entire evening looked different through his eyes now. While he spent the night trying to keep Janet unnoticed, the most important man in the room had been hoping to meet her. Alexander rubbed one hand across his jaw slowly before speaking. "You were looking for Janet specifically?" "Yes," Desmond answered without hesitation. Alexander gave a small nod, though his expression tightened immediately afterward. Janet watched him carefully. She knew that look. It appeared whenever Alexander felt emotionally cornered, but didn't know how to defend himself. Desmond glanced between them quietly. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, Alexander exhaled heavily. "I think Janet and I need a minute." Desmond understood immediately. "Of course," he said politely. Before stepping away, he looked toward Janet once more. "I'll be nearby." Then he disappeared back toward the larger crowd, though not far enough to seem detached from the situation entirely. Janet folded her arms slowly across herself once they were alone. Alexander avoided eye contact at first. The ballroom noise faded into the background again, while people nearby pretended not to notice the tension between them. But Janet knew they noticed. Everybody noticed. "You hid me," she said quietly. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. "Janet, no, don't rush past it this time." Her voice stayed calm, which somehow made the moment feel heavier. "You left me standing alone like you were afraid to be seen with me. That's not what I was doing." "Then what were you doing?" Alexander struggled for an answer immediately. That alone hurt, because if there had been a simple explanation, he would have given it already. He stopped and looked away toward the ballroom floor. "I got overwhelmed." "With me?" "No, but it involved me." He swallowed hard. Janet's eyes never left his face. Years together had taught her how to read him carefully. She could see the conflict happening inside him right now. Shame fighting against pride, honesty fighting against fear. Finally, Alexander spoke again. "You know how people in these environments can be." Janet's expression hardened slightly. "Say what you actually mean." Alexander hesitated, and that hesitation answered half the question already. His voice lowered. "Sometimes I notice the way people look at us." Janet stared at him quietly. "At you?" she asked. "At both of us." The honesty in his voice finally arrived. Messy, embarrassing, real. Alexander rubbed both hands together nervously before continuing. "I hate that it bothers me, but it does sometimes. I walk into these rooms already thinking about the assumptions people might make." Janet felt disappointment settle deeper inside her chest. Not shock, disappointment, because part of her already knew this truth long before tonight. "You were embarrassed," she said softly. "No. Yes, you were. I was nervous." "Nervous about what? Me being black?" The question came out painfully direct. Alexander looked down immediately. That silence hurt more than any argument could have. Janet nodded slowly to herself afterward. Wow. It sounds terrible when you say it like that. How else should I say it? Alexander finally looked at her again, desperation visible across his face now. Janet, listen to me. I love you. Tears burned behind her eyes instantly. Because she believed him, that was the hardest part. I know you love me, she whispered, but sometimes it feels like you love me more privately than publicly. Alexander looked physically crushed hearing that. The ballroom around them continued moving normally, glasses clinking, music playing, conversations continuing, but between them, everything felt painfully exposed now. I never wanted you to feel unwanted, he said quietly. Janet shook her head slowly. Tonight, I sat alone in a storage room because my own husband made me feel like a problem he needed to manage. Alexander's face tightened with immediate regret. She stepped closer carefully, her voice softer now but far more painful. I shouldn't have to be hidden. For several quiet seconds after Janet spoke, neither she nor Alexander moved. The weight of her words remained between them. I shouldn't have to be hidden. Alexander looked like he wanted to answer immediately, but nothing came out. His eyes stayed fixed on her face, while regret settled deeper across his expression. Janet looked away first, not angrily, mostly because she felt emotionally exhausted. She folded her arms tighter around herself and stared toward the ballroom windows, where snow continued falling softly outside. Then Desmond returned, not abruptly, not intrusively. He approached carefully enough to give them space while still making it clear he wasn't pretending the conversation never happened. Everything all right? He asked gently. Janet let out a small breath through her nose before answering. We're figuring that out. Desmond nodded once, understanding more than she actually said. Alexander straightened slightly beside her, clearly trying to regain some composure. Desmond looked toward Janet again. I hope this isn't a bad time to mention something important. Janet blinked lightly. Important? Yes. His tone shifted subtly then. Still warm, but more focused. There's a project I've been building through the company's community outreach division, he explained. A women's entrepreneurship initiative focused on helping local small business owners grow sustainable income through branding, mentorship, and marketing support. Janet listened carefully now. Desmond continued. A lot of talented women have strong ideas but lack access to visibility, design resources, or professional guidance. We're trying to change that. Something in Janet's posture changed slightly. Interest, real interest. Alexander noticed it too. Desmond folded one hand loosely in front of himself. When I saw your recent design work connected to the fundraiser online, I immediately remembered the clinic years ago, the organization, the communication style, the attention to people. Janet looked genuinely surprised again. You connected all that back to me? I did. Her voice softened. Why? Because people who care about community the way you do are rare. Alexander lowered his eyes briefly after hearing that. Janet stood very still, processing everything. The ballroom around them suddenly felt far away again. Just an hour ago, she sat alone inside a storage room, trying not to cry. Now one of the most respected men in the building was standing in front of her, offering professional recognition she never expected. It almost felt unreal. Desmond continued carefully. I'd like you to consult on the initiative. Janet stared at him, completely caught off guard. Me? Yes. She laughed softly from disbelief more than humor. I think you might be overestimating me. I don't. The answer came immediately. Firm, confident. Janet shook her head slowly. Desmond, I'm just a freelance designer from Rochester. And the simplicity of that response made her pause. Desmond's expression remained calm. You understand people. You communicate visually in a way that feels honest. And from what I remember, you lead naturally without trying to control a room. Alexander listened quietly beside her, while Desmond continued describing qualities he himself had overlooked publicly all evening. That realization seemed to hit him harder with every passing second. Janet glanced briefly toward Alexander before looking back at Desmond again. I wouldn't even know where to start with something that big. You wouldn't be doing it alone, Desmond assured her. This isn't about perfection, it's about perspective, and yours matters. No one had said words like that to Janet in a long time, not professionally, not publicly, especially not in a room like this. She felt emotional again, unexpectedly. though this time the feeling came from something entirely different. Validation. Alexander finally spoke quietly beside her. You'd actually be amazing at something like that. Janet looked toward him slowly. There was no hesitation in his voice now, no embarrassment, only honesty, and maybe even admiration. I mean it, he added carefully. You're better with people than anybody I know. Janet held his gaze for a moment, trying to decide whether she fully believed the change happening in front of her, yet Desmond stepped back slightly, giving the moment room to breathe. There's no pressure tonight, he said calmly. Think about it first. But I'd genuinely love to work with you. Janet looked between both men quietly. One had spent the night learning how much damage insecurity could cause. The other had reminded her that her value existed long before anybody else acknowledged it. For the first time that evening, Janet felt steady again, not invisible, not uncertain. Seen. She nodded slowly toward Desmond. I'd like to hear more. Desmond gave them both a respectful nod before stepping away again, not awkwardly, not like he was escaping tension, more like somebody mature enough to recognize when two people needed space to face each other honestly. Within seconds, he disappeared back into the larger crowd near the ballroom entrance, where several executives immediately approached him again. Janet watched him go briefly before lowering her eyes toward the floor. Neither she nor Alexander spoke right away. The silence between them felt completely different now. Earlier in the night, silence carried distance. Now, it carried exposure. Nothing hidden anymore. Alexander rubbed one hand slowly against the side of his glass, before finally speaking. I don't think I realized how bad this had gotten. Janet gave a small, tired laugh. Really? He nodded once. I knew I got uncomfortable sometimes. His voice stayed low and honest now. But hearing you say you felt hidden. He paused briefly. That hit me harder than I expected. Janet folded her arms loosely across herself again, though not defensively this time. You know what the worst part is? She asked quietly. Alexander looked at her carefully. I kept making excuses for you. The words landed gently, but painfully. Janet continued before he could interrupt. I told myself you were stressed from work, or nervous around executives, or distracted. She shook her head slowly, but every event somehow ended the same way. Me standing off to the side while you became somebody else. Alexander stared down into his drink. That's fair. No, Janet corrected softly. It's sad. The honesty in her voice made him close his eyes briefly. I never wanted you to feel less important. But I did. He nodded immediately this time. I know. A slow, instrumental song replaced the jazz set near the stage. Softer now. Slower. Couples gradually began moving toward the dance floor while conversations continued around the edges of the ballroom. Janet noticed Alexander watching them absent-mindedly. Then he laughed quietly to himself. What? You were right earlier. About what? These people actually do dance. That surprised a smile out of her. Small, but real. Alexander noticed it immediately. God, he missed making her smile. I was scared tonight, he admitted suddenly. Janet looked back at him carefully. Not of you, he clarified quickly. Of judgment, of attention, of people reducing us to assumptions before they even knew us. Janet stayed quiet. Alexander swallowed hard before continuing. I spent so much energy trying to control how people saw us that I stopped thinking about how I was making you feel. That honesty mattered, because for the first time all evening, he wasn't defending himself. He was finally seeing her clearly. Janet leaned lightly against the cocktail table beside them. Do you know how lonely that feels sometimes? Alexander looked devastated hearing that question. At home you love me openly, she continued softly. But in rooms like this, I can feel you pulling away before anybody even says anything. He nodded slowly. I know. No, Janet whispered. I don't think you did. The music drifted softly through the ballroom, while snow continued falling outside beyond the tall windows. Around them, people laughed and danced and carried on with their evening completely unaware of how much had shifted between the two of them tonight. Alexander set his glass down carefully. When I saw Desmond walking toward you earlier, he shook his head slightly. I think that was the moment I realized how badly I messed up. Janet studied his face quietly. You looked terrified, she admitted. I was. Why? Because he saw you immediately. Alexander's voice tightened slightly with emotion. He noticed everything I was trying not to deal with. Janet felt something soften inside her, hearing that truth spoken aloud. Not forgiveness yet, but understanding. Alexander looked at her carefully now. I hate that I made you question whether I was proud of you. A long silence followed. Then Janet finally answered honestly. I did question it. The pain in Alexander's eyes became impossible to hide after that. He stepped a little closer carefully, giving her enough room to move away if she wanted to. But she didn't. I love you, Janet, he said quietly. I know that's not enough to erase tonight, but it's true. Her throat tightened slightly, because despite everything, she loved him too. That was what made all of this hurt so much. The song near the dance floor shifted again into something slower and warmer. Alexander glanced toward it briefly before looking back at her. Then, carefully, almost nervously, he extended his hand toward her. Will you dance with me? Janet stared at him for a moment. This man had hurt her tonight, embarrassed her, made her feel emotionally abandoned. But he was also standing in front of her, now stripped of every defense he walked into the ballroom with earlier. Human, flawed, trying. Slowly, Janet placed her hand in his. Alexander guided her gently toward the dance floor, his hand warm against hers. And moments later, beneath the soft ballroom lights and falling snow outside the windows, they kissed quietly in the middle of the dance floor. Alexander's hand rested gently against Janet's back as they moved slowly across the dance floor. Neither of them cared whether they looked graceful. That wasn't the point anymore. The music filled the space softly while other couples swayed nearby. But for the first time that night, Janet no longer felt like she was standing outside of Alexander's world looking in. He was holding her openly now, without hesitation, without checking who might be watching. And Janet noticed the difference immediately, not because he suddenly became a different man, because he finally stopped shrinking around her. Alexander lowered his forehead briefly near hers while they danced. I'm sorry, he whispered again. This time, the words sounded fuller, not rushed, not defensive, just honest. Janet closed her eyes for a second, before answering quietly, I know you are. His hand tightened slightly against hers. No excuses this time. She looked up at him carefully. I let fear make decisions for me tonight, he admitted. And the worst part is, I convinced myself I was protecting us somehow. Janet gave a faint, sad smile. Protecting us from what? People judging us. He swallowed slowly. People questioning us, looking at us differently. Janet's expression softened, though pain still lingered underneath it. They were already doing that, she said gently. The only difference is, you let it control you. Alexander nodded immediately. You're right. The simple acceptance of responsibility mattered more to Janet than dramatic promises would have. Around them, the ballroom slowly settled into a calmer rhythm. The earlier excitement surrounding Desmond's arrival had faded into normal conversation again, though Janet occasionally noticed people glancing toward her and Alexander on the dance floor. But something had changed inside her now. Earlier those looks made her self-conscious. Now she barely cared. Alexander looked at her like he was seeing the emotional damage clearly for the first time. I hate knowing you sat in that storage room, feeling alone because of me, he admitted quietly. Janet lowered her eyes briefly. I honestly thought about leaving. That confession hit him hard. His movement slowed slightly. You did? Yes. Alexander exhaled slowly through his nose, and I would have deserved it. Janet studied his face carefully. For the first time all evening, she saw no social mask on him at all. No polished corporate version. No nervous overthinking, just her husband, a man realizing how close he came to damaging something important. The music shifted softly again, while they continued swaying together beneath the warm ballroom lights. Alexander glanced around the room briefly before looking back at her. You know what's embarrassing? What? I spent half the night acting like introducing you properly would somehow make things harder for me. A quiet laugh escaped him, though there was pain inside it. Meanwhile, the most respected man in the room walked straight past everybody else looking for you. Janet smiled faintly, despite herself. Alexander shook his head slowly. I should have been proud from the second we walked through those doors. Her chest tightened gently at that, not from hurt this time, from relief, because she needed to hear him say it. Not perfectly, not poetically, honestly. If you've ever waited for somebody you love, to finally understand the pain they caused. Then you already know why Janet nearly cried standing there in his arms. Not every apology fixes things immediately, but sincere accountability can soften wounds that anger never could. Alexander brushed his thumb carefully against her hand. "You should have been front and center," he said quietly. Janet stared at him for a moment after hearing those words, and for the first time that night, she believed him, not because he suddenly became flawless, but because he finally looked more afraid of losing her than losing other people's approval. A soft smile touched Janet's face slowly. Alexander noticed immediately and smiled back with visible relief. "There's my wife," he murmured. Janet laughed quietly under her breath. "Took you long enough. Fair." The tension between them eased another layer after that. Not erased completely. Some hurt still remained, but now there was honesty beside it, and honesty gave healing somewhere to begin. As the song came to an end, Alexander kept hold of her hand instead of letting go. "You ready to get out of here?" he asked softly. Janet glanced around the ballroom one final time. Earlier, the room felt cold, despite all its lights and luxury. Now it simply felt like another party. Nothing more. She nodded once. Together, hand in hand, Janet and Alexander walked off the dance floor and headed toward the ballroom exit side by side. This time, he never let go of her hand. Cold air wrapped around Janet and Alexander the moment they stepped outside Midtown Events Center. Snow still drifted steadily across downtown Rochester, coating the sidewalks and parked cars in soft white layers that reflected the city lights around them. The noise from the ballroom faded quickly once the heavy glass doors closed behind them. For the first time all night, everything felt quiet. Not awkward quiet, peaceful quiet. Alexander kept hold of Janet's hand as they walked slowly down the front steps together. Earlier that evening, she would have noticed every small hesitation in his body language. Now, there wasn't any. His hand stayed firm around hers openly, naturally, like he finally understood what that simple gesture meant. Janet looked up briefly toward the dark winter sky. Snowflakes landed softly against her hair before melting almost instantly from the warmth of her skin. "You cold?" Alexander asked. A little. Without hesitation, he removed his coat and draped it carefully around her shoulders. Janet looked at him quietly while adjusting the sleeves. "You don't have to freeze for me. I owe you at least a little frostbite after tonight." That earned a soft laugh from her. A real one. Alexander smiled hearing it. God, he missed hearing her laugh without tension underneath it. They walked slowly across the parking lot while snow crunched beneath their shoes. Their breaths drifted visibly into the cold air as nearby traffic moved quietly through downtown streets beyond the building. For several moments, neither spoke. Not because they lacked words, because neither of them wanted to rush past what tonight had forced them to face. Janet finally broke the silence first. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "I almost didn't come tonight." Alexander looked over immediately. "Really?" She nodded. "I changed outfits twice before you even came out of your office." A faint smile crossed her face. Part of me already knew I was nervous. Alexander's expression softened painfully, and I still made things worse. Janet looked down at the snowy pavement beneath them while they continued walking slowly toward the SUV. "You did," she admitted honestly. He nodded once. No defensiveness, no argument, just acceptance. That mattered to her more than he realized. Alexander opened the passenger door for her once they reached the vehicle, but Janet didn't get in immediately. Instead, she turned toward him carefully. "I need you to understand something. I'm listening. When people look at us differently." She paused briefly. "I already feel it too." Alexander's face tightened. "But I learned a long time ago that I can't survive by shrinking myself to make other people comfortable." The words settled heavily between them. Snow continued falling softly around them, while distant city lights shimmered across the icy streets nearby. Janet stepped a little closer. "What hurt tonight wasn't strangers judging us." Her voice remained calm. "It was feeling like you were judging us too." Alexander lowered his eyes immediately. "I know." "No," she whispered gently. "I think tonight was the first time you really understood it." He looked at her again after that, and for once, Janet saw no fear in his face at all, only regret and love. "I spent so much time worrying about how people would see us," he admitted quietly. that I forgot how lucky I was that you chose me in the first place. Emotion caught Janet unexpectedly in that moment, not because the line sounded perfect, because it sounded true. Alexander stepped closer until only a small space remained between them. When Desmond talked about you tonight, he shook his head lightly. I realized something. What? You've been extraordinary this entire time. A sad smile touched his face. I was just too distracted by my own insecurity to fully stand beside you the way I should have. Janet felt tears sting her eyes again, but this time she didn't fight them. One escaped quietly down her cheek, before Alexander gently brushed it away with his thumb. I love you, he said softly. I love you too. The answer came immediately, because despite everything that happened tonight, that part had never changed. Alexander leaned forward and pressed a slow kiss against her forehead while snow drifted around them in silence. Then he rested his forehead lightly against hers. I'm going to do better, he whispered. Janet closed her eyes briefly, not promising perfection, not promising they'd never struggle again, just promising growth, and somehow that felt more meaningful. Alexander squeezed her hand gently before opening the passenger door again. This time, Janet slid inside, smiling softly beneath his coat, while he walked around toward the driver's side. As he started the engine moments later, he glanced toward her one more time. Never again, he promised quietly. Winter did not disappear overnight in Rochester. The snow slowly thinned over weeks instead of days, leaving behind wet sidewalks, cold morning winds, and patches of gray ice tucked against curbs long after February ended. But eventually, little signs of spring began appearing around the city again. Coffee shop patios reopened. People walked without scarves. Sunlight stayed longer in the evenings. And somewhere between those gradual changes, life inside Janet and Alexander's marriage began changing too. Not perfectly, not magically, slowly, which made it real. 3 months after the company party, Janet sat inside a conference room downtown reviewing branding concepts spread across a long table, while Desmond listened carefully from the opposite side. The Women's Entrepreneurship Initiative had grown faster than anybody expected. Local business owners attended workshops every weekend now. Community partnerships expanded across Rochester neighborhoods. Small startup grants helped women launch catering businesses, online boutiques, design services, and wellness programs. And Janet had become one of the strongest creative voices behind it. At first, she almost turned the opportunity down, not because she lacked interest, because self-doubt spoke louder than confidence for years. But Desmond stayed consistent from the beginning, professional, encouraging, certain about her abilities even during moments she questioned herself. You always over-edit your first drafts, he told her one afternoon, while reviewing campaign materials together. Janet looked up from her laptop. Excuse me? You soften your strongest ideas before showing them to people. She laughed quietly. That sounds uncomfortably accurate. Desmond leaned back in his chair slightly. Confidence takes practice too. That sentence stayed with her longer than he probably realized. Because for most of Janet's adult life, she learned how to make herself easier for other people to accept. Smaller opinions, safer ideas, careful language. But now she slowly started trusting her own voice again, and Alexander noticed the difference immediately. One evening after Janet finished presenting branding proposals during a community workshop, Alexander waited near the back of the room watching her answer questions confidently beside projection screens filled with her designs. She looked comfortable standing in front of people now, not hidden, not hesitant, comfortable. When the session ended, Alexander walked toward her smiling proudly before she even reached him. You were incredible, he said. Janet laughed softly while gathering her notes together. You say that every time, because it's true every time. The warmth in his voice still surprised her occasionally, not because she doubted his love anymore, because now he expressed admiration openly, without fear attached to it. That mattered a lot. Over the following months, small changes continued appearing naturally between them. Alexander started introducing Janet first, during work dinners, instead of afterward. He invited her into conversations, instead of leaving her standing nearby silently. And perhaps most importantly, he stopped acting nervous whenever attention shifted toward them together. One Friday evening, they attended a networking mixer hosted by Alexander's department at a downtown restaurant overlooking the Genesee River. Months earlier, Janet would have entered a room like that already preparing herself emotionally for distance. This time felt completely different. The moment they walked inside, Alexander placed his hand gently against her back and smiled toward a group of coworkers approaching them. "Good to see you both," one man greeted. Alexander nodded proudly toward Janet immediately. "Have you met my wife, Janet?" No hesitation, no rushed introduction, no discomfort afterward. Just pride. Simple, natural pride. Janet noticed it instantly, and honestly. So did everybody else. The reactions around them had changed too, partly because Desmond publicly respected Janet's work now, but mostly because Alexander himself changed the tone people followed. Confidence influences rooms, and once Alexander stopped behaving like Janet needed to be managed carefully, other people stopped treating her that way too. That realization stayed quietly emotional for Janet. Later that evening, while driving home together, she rested her head lightly against the passenger seat and smiled toward Alexander. "What?" he asked. "You introduced me before talking about yourself." He glanced over briefly with a grin. "That's because you're impressive." Janet laughed softly. "You're laying it on thick tonight." "No," he answered honestly. "I'm catching up." The sincerity in his voice made her chest warm gently. Outside the windows, Rochester glowed beneath early spring rain, while headlights stretched across wet streets downtown. Things between them still weren't perfect all the time. Some conversations remained difficult. Some insecurities still needed work. But now they faced those moments together, instead of pretending they didn't exist. And that changed everything. Several weeks later, another formal company event appeared on Alexander's calendar. A larger one this time. Executives, investors, leadership teams. The exact kind of room that once made Alexander emotionally retreat from Janet without realizing it. The evening of the event, Janet stood in front of the bedroom mirror, fastening an earring carefully, while Alexander adjusted his tie nearby. Then he looked at her and smiled immediately. No hesitation this time. "You look beautiful," he said. Janet turned slowly toward him. The warmth in his eyes felt completely different now. Confident, certain, proud. Alexander crossed the room toward her and offered his hand gently. "Ready?" Janet smiled softly before placing her hand in his, and together, they headed toward another company party. The second company event felt different before Janet and Alexander even reached the entrance. Maybe it was the weather. Spring air carried a softness winter lacked, and downtown Rochester no longer looked buried beneath snow and silence. Streetlights reflected against damp sidewalks, while restaurants buzzed with evening conversation and music drifting through partially open doors. Or maybe the difference had nothing to do with Rochester at all. Maybe it was simply the way Alexander held her hand confidently while walking beside her. No hesitation, no distance, no nervousness hiding beneath fake composure. Just certainty. Janet noticed it immediately, and this time she allowed herself to enjoy it instead of questioning whether it would disappear later. The event was being held at another upscale venue downtown, larger than Midtown Event Center and filled with many of the same corporate faces from months earlier. The moment they entered the ballroom, Janet felt the memory of that previous night brush softly across her mind. The dessert table, the silence, the storage room, the feeling of standing alone while Alexander disappeared into the crowd. For one brief second, anxiety touched her chest again. Alexander noticed instantly. He squeezed her hand gently. "You okay?" Janet nodded once. "Yeah," but Alexander understood anyway. Without another word, he pulled her slightly closer beside him before leading her farther into the ballroom together. Almost immediately, several coworkers approached them, smiling. "Alexander, good to see you again." "Janet, congratulations on the initiative. We've been hearing great things." Janet smiled politely, still adjusting to the difference in energy around her now. Alexander rested one hand lightly against the middle of her back while greeting people, and then something happened that would have seemed small to anybody else watching, but not to Janet. One executive extended his hand toward Alexander first. Alexander shook it briefly, then immediately turned toward Janet with a proud smile already on his face. "This is my wife, Janet." Not rushed, not hesitant, not secondary. His wife. Janet felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her throat, because months ago, those simple words would have cost him visible effort. Now they came naturally. The executive smiled warmly toward her. "I've heard your work with Desmond's initiative has been outstanding." Janet thanked him politely, while Alexander remained beside her the entire conversation, not drifting away, not scanning the room for escape. Present. As the evening continued, the pattern repeated naturally again and again. Every introduction, every conversation, every interaction, Alexander included Janet openly without needing reminders. And slowly, Janet realized something important. The room itself hadn't changed nearly as much as she once believed. Alexander had. Confidence has a way of teaching people how to behave around you. Months earlier, his discomfort silently gave others permission to overlook her. Now his pride made people pay attention differently, not because Janet suddenly became more valuable, because Alexander finally stopped acting afraid of her value being seen. Later in the evening, Janet stepped briefly onto a balcony overlooking downtown Rochester, while soft music drifted through the ballroom behind her. The city lights stretched beautifully across the distance while cool spring air brushed gently against her skin. A moment later, Alexander joined her outside carrying 2 glasses of water. "You disappeared," he said lightly. "I needed air." He handed her 1 glass before leaning beside her against the railing. For a few seconds, they simply looked out across the city together. Then Janet smiled softly to herself. "What? You know what's funny?" "What?" "The last time we were at an event like this, I ended up hiding in a storage room." Alexander winced immediately. "Please don't remind me." Janet laughed quietly, but then her expression softened again. "I'm glad we stayed together." Alexander turned toward her fully after hearing that. "So am I." The honesty in his voice still reached her every time, not because perfection suddenly existed between them, because growth did, and growth requires honesty most people avoid. Alexander took a slow breath before speaking again. "I think I spent a lot of my life worrying about being accepted in rooms like these." He glanced back toward the ballroom behind them briefly. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot acceptance doesn't mean anything if it costs you the person you love." Janet looked at him quietly. That version of Alexander, emotionally aware, humble, open, felt stronger than the polished corporate version he used to hide behind. She stepped closer and rested her head lightly against his shoulder. Far below them, headlights moved through Rochester streets while spring wind carried the distant sounds of the city upward. Eventually, they left the event together, hand in hand once again. Later that night, standing quietly on the front porch of their townhouse beneath the soft glow of the porch light, Janet looked out across the peaceful neighborhood, while Alexander wrapped one arm around her shoulders. The world around them felt calm now, steady, earned. Alexander kissed the side of her head gently, and Janet smiled, knowing something important had changed forever between them. Not because humiliation disappeared from their past, but because they learned what love actually required moving forward. Respect, visibility, honesty, courage. Some people spend their whole lives searching for respect in crowded rooms, while others finally learned that love was never supposed to hide.